Hello and welcome to today's fifth episode of the Stormwater Sessions Live webinar series on this Tuesday, September 10th. I'm glad you could be here with us today. My name is Ben Curtis. I'm with ISWEP, Iowa Stormwater Education Partnership. Today joined by Gregory LeFevre. I will introduce Greg quick, do some housekeeping, and then we'll jump right in. Gregory is an assistant research engineer and assistant professor of environmental engineering at the University of Iowa's IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering Department. Gregory and his team research emerging contaminants in stormwater and how to apply low energy natural treatment systems to sustainably improve water quality and mitigate non-point pollutants. Gregory received his PhD at the University of Minnesota, studying the biodegradation of petroleum hydrocarbons in rain gardens. Furthering there, he went on to do his postdoc at Stanford University, researching plant-based remediation for water recycling and large-scale stormwater capture, treatment, recharge systems. Some cool research. Gregory started here in Eastern Iowa at the University of Iowa in 2016, and I think he'll probably have a little more on his background here in a few slides. So before I turn it over to Gregory, just wanted to remind everyone listening for a few housekeeping items. This pretty much the same thing I say every month, but just to reiterate, if you have any questions, and I hope you do throughout the presentation, Greg said he's got some slides prepared for questions that might come up, so please ask questions. Type them in the chat box or in the question box. Either way, I will see them and moderate at the end of the session today, probably around 12:50. Last week I did have some issues, or last month I did have some issues with sound. Hopefully that doesn't happen this time. Regardless, we'll get your questions answered. So we'll have about 10 minutes at the end to proctor questions for Gregory. Again, if you're listening as a group, make sure to email me a list of who's on the other line of those attendees so I can send out certificates for professional development hours. The same link that I've provided in the past to subscribers of the series will be available later this week, which will include this broadcast. I'll get that up and then I'll make sure to send out certificates as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Gregory and let him take it away.
All right, Ben, thanks very much for the kind introduction. And I'm really excited to be here. Even though I can't see you, I will be waving my hands like I normally do during a presentation, only it's behind a screen that you can't see. So I'm going to be taking hopefully you on a little bit of a journey on what I consider kind of a neglected area of water quality related to stormwater. And that's really focusing on dissolved contaminants in stormwater. And we're going to look at what they are, the impacts to water quality, and a few areas of trying to address them. So some things that are going into practice already, as well as some cutting edge research on ways to improve it. So just to get everybody on the same page, we know that when we develop natural and more agricultural rural areas into more intense urban zones, that results in an increase in impervious surface and more runoff. It still rains in all these areas. And so we've historically been concerned about stormwater from just a water quantity, a flooding perspective. But we're all aware now that stormwater is capable of transporting and moving large quantities of non-point pollutants. And oftentimes these are not, sometimes, for example, in this image right here, the oil slick is going into a storm sewer and this is going to go straight into the river untreated. So we do have to be concerned about the water quality aspects of stormwater and the impacts that they will have onto the receiving waters as well. And so we're really interested in the alternative of using green infrastructure from the perspective of trying to more closely emulate the pre-development hydrologic regime through infiltration-based methods. So if you have something like a stormwater bioretention cell, the water is directed into there, captured, and infiltrates in, it reduces the total volume, the peak flows, and then infiltrates the water into the shallow groundwater, with the additional benefit of the removal of many non-point pollutants in there as well. One of the things that I want to bring up is really focusing on new research and new awareness of the importance of dissolved pollutants in stormwater. So what I'm going to cover here is, for dissolved pollutants, first off, why do we care about them? What are they? And then what are some of the solutions that are taking shape to try to mitigate and address them? So first off, what are dissolved pollutants versus particle pollutants? Everybody knows about sediments in stormwater. It's super visible, and anybody that's seen this from a construction runoff site, or that's typically what we have silt fences for, and these are really important problems, right? But those are sometimes the most visible. So let's look at some comparing dissolved versus particle pollutants. We know that many stormwater pollutants are particle associated, but a substantial fraction are also in the dissolved phase. And we don't want to just ignore the dissolve phase. The old paradigm for stormwater pollutants used to be that if you capture the particles, you remove the pollutants. And we know that's just not true anymore. And that's actually really important because dissolved pollutants can't be filtered in the same conventional capacity. And they also pose a risk to the underlying groundwater during infiltration-based practices. So one of the things I worked on during my grad school, one of my first projects was to create a literature review on potential for soil and groundwater or contamination due to stormwater infiltration practices and some of the risks involved in that at the St. Anthony Falls lab. So let's look again, what are some of the defining features of dissolved pollutants here? We know they won't settle with particles, right? So these are things that are in the dissolve phase, and you can kind of think of, right, I mean, the difference between, a discrete particle like a sand or a sediment or a bacterium cell, right, that can be settled in a pond, or it can be physically filtered. And I put a little asterisk there that it's a lot of chemical or dissolved pollutants. If they are chemically adsorbed onto a particle, which sometimes they can be, then they can settle. And sometimes they can be chemically filtered, if you will, through adsorption processes, but it's not the same as conventional settling and filtering. Dissolved pollutants will transport farther. They'll tend to infiltrate more if you are doing infiltration-based practices, like a lot of low LID practices. They tend to be more bioavailable to organisms that are in receiving water because it's right into the dissolve phase, right, as opposed to being particle associated. And they also pose greater risk to groundwater contamination. So one of the things that we did also through this project was to write a review paper that's was published in 2015. And if there's any of these things, I have links and stuff like that all on my website, but you can always send me an email if you want an original copy of the paper, because if you don't have access through some things because they're behind a journal paywall or something. But what we did was we tried to look at dissolved pollutants in stormwater and look at some of their risks and removal, and particularly in bioretention cells. And so this was a project that we did really focused on kind of a small scale. One of the growing justifications and motivations for understanding dissolved pollutants is actually in, you get outside of the traditional area for LID and the Atlantic coast or the Midwest or the Pacific Northwest. And in some places that are larger, more dry climates, people are looking at urban runoff as a potential water supply recharge system. These pictures are actually from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and this is a project that we had worked on where they were going in and collecting stormwater from a nearby neighborhood and taking an old gravel pit. So you can see in the left-hand corner here, this is actually an aerial photo, and it's an old gravel mining pit. And so it's over it's an alluvial aquifer, and people are going in and want to put this park into it, which is really cool, right? You get some urban revitalization, a more utilitarian or useful space than a big empty hole in the ground. And people are building these huge infiltration galleries to be able to go in and capture stormwater and put it into put it into the ground. And the idea is that this could provide a substantial fraction for future drinking water supplies. And so one of the concerns that we had and brought up was, okay, you want to do this, this is great, but if you actually look into this watershed, there's a substantial amount of automotive recycling, and there really wasn't any treatment associated with this here. And dissolved pollutants could potentially go into that and pollute the groundwater that's underneath there. And if you don't think that, I mean, if you think that this is something that's only a consideration for crazy water-starved Californians, like you know, on the West Coast or something, groundwater recharge and using stormwater for that is actually something that people are thinking about, even in the upper Midwest. There's a really cool report that was out from Minnesota called Beneath the Ground Surface, and looking at groundwater depletion in the upper Midwest generally. And I love this photo because it's so visual and salient to see how just outside of St. Paul, where they're going in and harvesting the groundwater, you can see docks and the edge of where the water used to be. The lake is going down so much because of groundwater depression. You can actually see that this is a map from aquifer drawdown in the Twin Cities metro area. And if you think that that's still not close enough to home, this is you know, the aquifer drawdown presently in Iowa. You can see large amounts of drawdown in the two largest metropolitan areas in the state, near Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, Iowa City area. And so a lot of this is caused by the fact that we go in and take out substantial amounts of groundwater, and then when it's treated as wastewater, it goes into there. So, or it goes into a river and is washed away. And that groundwater takes a long time to replace. There could be opportunities to use stormwater as a recharge opportunity, because and then transform it from basically a waste product to a resource. But we want to make sure that that is done responsibly. So this is actually a picture from Bob Liebert, the former state geologist, and doing some forward modeling in terms of where some of the additional aquifer drawdown would be, indicating that it's going to probably become even more severe. You can't really see it. So why do we care? We know that it has important impacts on water quality. And we also know that from a human health and drinking exposure perspective, there's a lot of important motivation for going in and improving water quality prior to it going into the ground. So what are some of these dissolved contaminants in stormwater? First off are dissolved nutrients. Oftentimes we think of nutrients as being particle associated. That's not necessarily true. And particularly, we know that in urban and suburban catchments, we know that there are substantial amounts of nitrogen and dissolved phosphorus. If we look at nitrogen specifically, the dissolved form tends to be nitrate, the oxidized form of nitrogen. And this is highly soluble and will be transported a long way from its original source, right? Ammonium, which is sometimes what people put down as fertilizers, can be much more likely to adsorb to clays and soils because it has a positive charge and it'll go under the negative charge of the clays. But oftentimes this gets oxidized to nitrate and then becomes very water soluble and moves. So the other thing, which is oftentimes even a greater concern for urban stormwater and lakes that are within metropolitan areas, is phosphorus. And phosphorus is oftentimes typically thought of as being a particle associated compound or the element, right, and a nutrient to deal with, which is oftentimes true. But if we only look at the particle phase, on average, about a third of total phosphorus is in the dissolve phase, and sometimes up to 90%. So we can do a good job of helping to remove, sometimes half or the majority by getting rid of particles. And I'm not trying to discount that or say that that's not important, but if we ignore the dissolved phosphorus, the phosphate phase, that can be a really critical aspect, and so phosphorus is oftentimes the limiting nutrient in freshwater systems, particularly more lakes rather than even rivers. And so if you look at this background photo that I have here, this is actually a picture from one of my graduate students that she took it at Green Valley Lake down in southwest of Des Moines earlier this season. And you can see the pea soup looking color green here. And this is, we know that harmful algal blooms like this are the result of excess nutrients in our watershed. So we really want to make sure that this is an acute human health risk, as well as recreational and degrading the overall value of the water. So dissolved metals are also an important aspect. Again, this is something that typically we think of metals to be in the particle phase, things like cadmium, copper, lead, zinc, but something like a fifth to a half can also be present in the dissolved phase. So we go into some of that and a little bit into modeling in different conditions and the effect of water chemistry in there in that review paper. So again, I'm happy to send that to anybody. And so depending on practices that are in the watershed, for example, in this photo, everything is just on the open air. A lot of places now require that these facilities, industrial stormwater facilities, have, for example, roofs so that it's not in the open. But metals are also present in a lot of vehicles. Here's a picture that we were looking at a stormwater facility in Denver, and everything is running off of a zinc-coated roof. So obviously there's a pretty major source right there. Road salts are what I like to call the most important, boring problem that's out there, because salts we know that they're almost 100% in the dissolve phase. They also don't really do anything. Like a lot of organic contaminants and metals transform and complex and do all these other kind of really interesting scientific things. Road salt doesn't do anything. So it's really boring, but it's really important. There's massive quantities of road salts that get put out into the environment. It's 100% dissolvable. And chloride, we know, is toxic to aquatic life. It has impacts to surface water and groundwater, to the point that in some locations, for example, in the area where I used to live in Minneapolis, there were some lakes near highways that wouldn't turn over in their normal limnologic phases in the spring and the fall because there was such a salinity gradient introduced from road salt that you would have ocean conditions in the bottom of the lake. And these are applied in the hundreds of tons per square mile, and you'll sometimes see grams per liter. So I say that this is it's a wicked problem in terms of how do we deal with this, because you do have to balance, obviously, the need for public safety. And so finally, I'm going to talk also about organic contaminants in stormwater. And anybody that's ever walked through a grocery store parking lot with a little drizzle in the air has seen these rainbow sheen oil slicks going back through your car, right? It's kind of, you very much see that, right? Those are some things that are very visible, but substantial amounts of organic contaminants in stormwater are from all kinds of different usage. I kind of separate these out by urban use biocides, which provide a substantial amount of flux of these types of various different pesticides and antimicrobials from people's yards and buildings and road right-of-ways, things like herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. And for example, these are used to keep molds and mildews from growing on people's houses and keeping the paint from degrading, and used for urban landscaping and right-of-ways and things, and or control of invasive species. So there's lots of these in there, and these are the things that you don't necessarily see. There's things like corrosion inhibitors and insecticides and things that are used on buildings as well. And then there are things that are more vehicularly related. So these would be things that come from the cars themselves, as well as the vehicle exhaust and the fluids that come from cars. For example, tire rubber vulcanizers and tire additives that are used on that break down, the anti-corrosives and the glycols that are in antifreeze and other fluids, and then as well as things that are like PAHs from the pavements themselves, as well as tires and exhausts. So this is actually a really active area of research right now, and this is where my expertise is understanding the fate and transformation of organic contaminants in stormwater. And this, I want to call attention to this study that was just published about like last week, a study from the USGS where they did a nationwide looking at urban stormwater and called it an overlooked pathway for extended mixed contaminants to surface and groundwater in the United States, particularly for organics. And it's really an overlooked pathway for these compounds, and they have important biological effects. What I think was really interesting about this study is that sometimes the levels are really quite high of certain things. Over on this axis where my mouse cursor is going, I mean, this is on a log scale in nanograms per liter, but some of these things are in the hundreds to thousands of nanograms per liter of some things like pharmaceuticals, and pesticides are some of the most ubiquitous things. Some things that are fungicides and insecticides that you would not necessarily expect to see in an urban environment, because sometimes you associate them more with either agriculture or specific usages, but they have urban applications, and stormwater thus has become a really important pathway for them to get into water bodies. Another important field of work that I want to mention is this study this work that's coming out of the University of Washington at their Center for Urban Waters. They've been looking at trying to understand this thing called urban stormwater mortality syndrome. And what happens is that when the coho salmon come in to breed, everything is happy and everything is good, except if it rains and highway runoff goes into the streams. And they've eliminated all kinds of common water quality concerns that would normally affect fish, and that's not it. And basically they've narrowed it down to organic compounds that leach from tire dust. So, I mean, everybody that's ever driven a car, you know that tires only last for a certain length of time, whether it's 40, 60, 80,000 miles or something, right? When the tires wear away, they don't just evaporate, right? They go someplace, and all that wears off as dust on the road. And what's happening is that when it rains, even just a little bit, that runoff going into the stream, this particular type of salmon is very sensitive to these types of contaminants, and they absorb it right through their gills, and it causes them to die within minutes. And so they've been using high resolution types of analytical chemistry to be able to go and identify some of these compounds that are really critical. And so this is a direct impact in there. We obviously don't have coho salmon in Iowa, right? But for example, not far off of the 380 highway going in through Cedar Rapids is actually a designated cold water trout stream. And so there are important water quality implications for sensitive species there too. So what are some of the solutions? This is where I want to kind of spend some of the most time here, because I hope that by this point you've seen some of the reasons why these are, why dissolved pollutants in stormwater are important and why we should care about them. And so what I'm going to do is lay out some of the challenges associated with them, and then some of the new areas of research that people are trying to do to help understand their fate and contribute to developing more sustainable solutions for their capture and mitigation. So here's what I see as the challenge. That is that many emerging organic contaminants, particularly, and dissolved pollutants generally, are water soluble, right? That's what makes them dissolved, right? They're in the dissolve phase, like, dissolve like a sugar cube, right? And so they poorly absorb onto soils or other particles. And so they can go into the groundwater. They can impact the groundwater underneath there, right? But at the same time, contaminants might accumulate in green infrastructure practices if they're not removed. There was actually a popular press article that it was in a trade magazine that had looked at some of my research and it's about hydrocarbons and stormwater, and they had put this headline about are rain gardens going to be the next toxic waste dump for cities to deal with, and it was an attention-grabbing headline, but our research showed that no, it is not. So that's good, right? But we have these competing interests. We need to make sure that we're protecting the underlying groundwater while not accumulating things in there. So number one goal is source control. That's what I always say, right? Is we want to make sure that we reduce the number of pollutants that are even present in the watershed. And so I'll put a couple of positive examples in here, is that people are using technology. For example, there's nothing that you can do to remove road salt short of going in and doing some sort of crazy distillation or reverse osmosis or something that would be completely non-economically feasible or practical or energy efficient or anything. Once road salt gets into stormwater, right? What we want to do is keep it out of there in the first place. So people are using higher tech methods to go in and just put salt where it's needed. And you can reduce the amount of salt that is laid down onto roadways substantially. And this also helps save money and has all kinds of other benefits as well. And people have done also things that are relatively simple mechanical removal of ice, which actually does a whole lot better job of making sidewalks safe by just using these rotating brush things on the front end of a bobcat. They work so much better, and there have been some studies where people can go in and reduce their salt consumption, particularly on things like sidewalks and other places, by 2/3 just by going and switching to mechanical means. Other things are going in and making sure that the amount of fertilizers that are used in and sold by local hardware stores and things like that have lower levels of phosphorus or no phosphorus at all. Some of it is regulatory. I have the picture over here of the person putting on these blacktop pavement reseal or seal coating, and that's actually there's been some work by the USGS that had shown that certain types of coal tar based blacktop seal coats were the largest source of PAHs in urban lakes in a lot of places throughout the country. And there have been now multiple states as well as certain counties and municipalities that have made the application illegal. And so some of that is by legislation. There's other substitutes that work just as well. And so that's one way of instituting source control. Another thing is dealing with legacy issues, right? This is a power transformer, and people have found that even one power transformer that leaks or something like that in a watershed, and especially in legacy cities, there's a lot of problems with this and stormwater this is a study where we're looking at them PCBs in stormwater in Baltimore, and just a single power transformer that was leaking could essentially contaminate the stormwater of an entire air or watershed. It's very kind of depressing, but also important where the source control is. So let's look at our actual removal processes here and compare and contrast a little bit. First, we have physical removal processes. So we have settling, which is things like ponds and hydrodynamic separators, as well as filtration. And this is highly effective for particles. And so because a lot of things that even somewhat in the dissolve phase can become particle associated, we do need to remove those particles. So don't ignore the particles, just don't exclusively focus on them. So let's look at what is necessary to remove compounds in the dissolve phase. We can do chemical removal processes, and these would be things like adsorption onto media of the geomedia or the bioretention media that's present in the LID project, as well as volatilization can be a possible thing, but that's not really applicable to most things. So that's why I kind of put it there, but not. And then we also have biological removal. So these would be biodegradation by fungi or bacteria that are endemic living in there, and also plant uptake. So the reason why we want to really understand removal from a process-based perspective is because if you're going in and doing some large-based approach, like going in this this large stormwater capture, treatment, recharge facility, where we're going in and trying to transform stormwater from being a waste to a resource, we really took a unit operations perspective on here. So this was from a project that we did in California, where we're trying to look at all the different unit operations that were in there. I'll go into these a little bit. So I coined the term stormwater CTR, or capture, treatment, and recharge. And we developed this in the arid West, but this is also something that is, I think, an important piece of a groundwater recharge portfolio, as well as just improving water quality generally. So we do want to have a pre-treatment facility. We do want to go in and have some sort of pond for being able to go in and have some sort of storage as well in there. That's important for being able to buffer and provide freeboard in there. And we get solids settling and removal. That's still important, right? We also can have some things like photolysis of organics and UV disinfection of pathogens in there. We also integrate in iron enhanced sand filtration for removal of some metals as well as phosphorus. We're also using a wood chip denitrifying bioreactor that was present in the system, and then using various different geomedia for trace organics removal before finally going and recharging into the groundwater. And so this was stuff that we were testing as a stormwater CTR treatment train, and what we wanted to test at a field scale at that LA site. And there's some of the things that we would also think would be important for any larger scale system for really recharging stormwater on a large scale. So what I propose and try to get out there here is what I'm calling this new framework for the bioretention. And I put the emphasis there because in order to address that challenge that I put forth before, where we need to be able to go in and couple the rapid contaminant capture via absorption to media during the rapid infiltration, right, from transients, unsteady flow through a stormwater system, with biological degradation to sustain the pollutant removal. Because if you need to be able to have enhanced capture so that dissolved pollutants don't go through and then contaminate groundwater, but you also need to be able to sustain that degradation so that it doesn't go in and accumulate into there. So there's this balance here. So I'm first going to go in and talk a little bit about some of the ways for improving the capture from a research perspective, and some of the cutting edge stuff that some collaborators have been doing, and then I'll go more into the degradation part, which is the area of my research as well. So one way that people are going in and trying to improve the geomedia for chemical dissolved pollutant removal is to go in and improve the actual mineral composition of the media that's there. For example, taking pyrolyzed wood biomass and converting it to biochar, so a black carbon source, and then going in and, for example, using recycled scrap iron and taking iron filings. And so this is actually some work that was done at the St. Anthony Falls lab at the University of Minnesota by some collaborators. And they were going and taking this iron sand filtration media, and they've done it on a lab scale. They've also done it at a field scale, and gone in and done it both for urban stormwater as well as for some agricultural drainage. And some things, have been learned kind of the hard way about how much you can put in, or some of the conditions so it doesn't turn into a brick. But they've gone in and been very successful, removing, like about almost 90% of the dissolved phosphorus in the influent with this type of enhanced iron enhanced sand media. So that's a really important piece of the dissolved nutrient removal. Another aspect for geomedia is incorporating different types of black carbon, things like biochar, like the pyrolyzed biomass that I was talking about before, and also activated carbon for removing these types of trace organic contaminants. And this is, there's other types of benefits. People are using biochar as an agricultural soil amendment to increase soil holding moisture capacity and other types of things. And some people look at it also from a carbon sequestration perspective, but mostly we're looking at it as a way of increasing the ability for the bioretention media to be able to go in and adsorb dissolved pollutants that would normally kind of just pass through because they're pretty water soluble. Some of these have dual purposes. This graph is actually looking at a column breakthrough curve here. So the relative concentration coming through time. And so what happens here is they're looking at bacteria, right? That's an important consideration for stormwater. And putting in iron filings was able to retain all of the bacteria in there. And biochar was able to go in and improve the removal compared to just the sand. Finally, there's important developments on being able to go in and have what they refer to as reactive mineral geomedia. And so what this graph is looking at the loss rates for different types of organic contaminants in so the higher the number, the better it is as far as the losses, right? Looking at it, manganese oxide coated sands. And so these are reactive with different types of things like pesticides and vehicle related compounds. And just the percolation of the contaminated stormwater through these mineral coated sands is able to go in and degrade them. So these are things that we had tested in different types of approaches, and we're still working on, some of this is still in publication phase and stuff like that. Some of it was published already, and so these were done at a field scale with by conditioning the columns with real stormwater that had been collected and put into a tank. So it's sort of like on this pilot scale type of approach where it's, we can control things in the lab, but it's also using very realistic conditions. So the vision there was to be able to go in and try and develop and optimize, particularly for more dense urban areas where you would want to have, things would be kind of small, and then look at things like putting together different types of layering schemes and being able to go in and, making stormwater systems smart and being able to use sensors and actuators to be able to control the hydraulic retention time through there. And those are really important and being developed. And so that's I think going in and putting that all together is a really cool active area of research. But looking at the improvements of stormwater geomedia to improve the capture of dissolved pollutants is really important here. So I'm going to go back to this framework here. So we started on the capture part. And so that's really looking at how to improve the sorption and reactivity of the media itself. And so if we capture this stuff, now we don't want it to just accumulate forever, right? And so the research that I do is looking at biological degradation approaches to sustain that pollutant removal. And so what I do is we've looked at a couple different areas. One of them is microbial processes. And so here we look at biodegradation of organic contaminants as well as denitrification. So here we're back to petroleum hydrocarbons. The reason why we're actually really interested in this, as I mentioned, these coal tar-based asphalt seal coats are actually a large contributor to pH flux in here. And what some municipalities had found this was that the stormwater ponds, they needed to be dredged on their normal, 20 to 30 year cycle. And when they were going in and looking at the sediments, the levels of pHs in the bottom of these stormwater pond sediments were so high that they had to be treated as and considered hazardous waste and disposed of in a hazardous waste landfill, which is, not only depressing, it shows that the pond is working to capture those things, but at the same time, what that was doing was that just in the Minneapolis metropolitan area alone, there was over $1 billion of environmental liability that was now being borne by cities and towns for having to deal with this. So the question that I had, and that was the subject of my graduate work, was what happens if instead those hydrocarbons were directed and went into a rain garden instead? And so we really looked at microbial communities in here. And if you look here at where my mouse is, if we look at the gene copies per gram of soil, just pay attention to this black bar. So that's the naphthalene hydroxyl or monooxygenase gene, dioxygenase gene. And what you can see is that the other bars kind of all look the same. But if we look at the media just initially, if you were to put it into a system, you see none of these. If you go and you plant the system, you see a little bit, but at very low levels. But after some exposure to it, the microbial community is able to go in and adapt and develop itself for biodegradation. These genes are encoding for the ability to break down pHs. And then we see that after a relatively short time period, it's almost to the levels that were found in long-term exposed in the field. So that's really promising. Furthermore, we found that sites that had deep-rooted vegetation, like native prairie plants and everything, had much lower levels of TPH, total petroleum hydrocarbons, and much higher levels of biodegradation functional genes than places that were either just lawn grass or unplanted systems, suggesting that these had greater capacity to biodegrade. So we also know that we can improve denitrification by altering the redox conditions in the bioretention. This is actually something that's been proposed a long time ago by adding a saturated layer into there. And we've worked on going in and trying to improve the modeling of these using things like wood chips as a carbon source in there. So I'm going to talk about some vegetative processes that are important in bioretention systems and some of the things that they do. We know that they alter the microbial communities and the sorption dynamics of compounds. I'm not going to talk about that today. We'll talk a little bit about direct uptake of contaminants and plant metabolism. So we had a paper that was earlier this year that was a review. So it's kind of very accessible to everyone, and we also wanted to make it for municipalities and practitioners for talking about the importance of vegetation and bioretention for stormwater systems. So again, that's available if anybody wants it. So here's just one example. We were looking at plant metabolism of benzotriazole corrosion inhibitors. These are found in antifreeze and aircraft de-icing fluids, as well as some compounds that were tire rubber associated. And these are really recalcitrant in the environment. They don't break down, even if they go through a wastewater treatment plant, they just kind of pass right through. And that is designed to break down things. But what we found here is, like, if we look on this y-axis here, this is a mass balance on a log scale. What we could do is, if it's exposed to plants, we see in the blue, it rapidly goes away over the course of even just a day or two. But it doesn't, when we look at what's in the plant tissue, it's actually, we don't see it accumulating in the plant tissue. We can spike it again. So our analytical chemistry should be better than that. So our question was, if this is happening with all these compounds, what is it transforming into? So that's actually what my lab does, and that's probably beyond the scope of what we're trying to talk about here today, but we do products and pathway discovery also for what happens when stormwater contaminants go into the environment. We can try to figure out what happens if they're exposed to plants, or if there are if they biodegrade or transform in the environment. So we've also been doing some work with isothiazolone biocides. These are things that come off of building facades and go into rain gardens potentially. People have probably already contacted these today. They're in things like your soaps and shampoos, and you might not even know that they're there. And we've also found that these are really amenable to being taken up directly by plants. And so what we're trying to do, this is some unpublished data right here, just a little nugget here, but we're seeing that it's really fast. Even with just a couple of hours of exposure, we think that the plants are actively taking up these compounds into their tissues. And so this could be a remediation approach. So finally, the last piece I'm going to talk about here is we're also interested in understanding fungal processes, because we see cool opportunities to be able to exploit the really strong enzymes that fungi have. And this could be something that could potentially be bio-augmented into stormwater systems to help biodegrade accumulated contaminants. So we've done some work that are more on the lab-based scale for that, but we envision getting bigger. We've also been working with some of the tire wear compounds that are really difficult to degrade that have that impact on the salmon too. So really kind of to, excuse me, to conclude here is that we know that dissolved pollutants are important too. We can't discount those particles, but so many of our best management practices are predicated on the removal of particles. They're important, but we can't ignore the dissolve phase. Otherwise, we could be ignoring anywhere between 20 to 80% of the contaminants, depending on what they are. Particularly for emerging organic contaminants, dissolved metals, and a certain fraction of nutrients too. These pose a greater risk to groundwater as well as transport in surface water. We need to understand the watershed sources, which is kind of really amorphous, particularly from because these are non-point sources or contaminants, and particularly for organic contaminants. We need to understand more about their chemical characteristics. We know that metals can be captured in here, but the depressing thing about metals is that, yes, they can be complex and they can slightly change form and stuff. And but unfortunately, unlike the organics where you can have plants and bacteria and fungi go in and degrade them, metals can't ultimately degrade. And salts are even more depressing because you can't even capture them. This is really only a story of source control. So in order to improve things like stormwater bioretention and LID systems, what I propose is that we need to improve our ability to combine rapid chemical sorption during these unpredictable rainstorms and things like that, during rapid infiltration, to improve that removal with sustainable biodegradation processes for organics. So we can maximize the longevity and minimize the maintenance, quite frankly, also for municipalities. So finally, I'll close by saying that I think the future is outside of a pipe, both in terms of the challenges that we face and then also the opportunities that we have. And if we understand the fundamental mechanisms, I say that because I'm a researcher, right? But I want to translate this to everybody that's a practitioner and a municipality too. We need to understand our pollutants that are in our watersheds. If we can exploit the natural energetic processes that are in there, that means that there's less work that we have to do to remove them. And then we can create treatment systems that are more reliable, robust, and transferable to different systems. And then we can start really thinking of stormwater as a resource, not a waste product for our cities. So with that, I'll close with a thank you, and to especially all my students in the lab here at University of Iowa. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions in the last remaining 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Excellent work. we do have one question that just came in. I'll read it to you here, and then we'll see if we can get an answer. It says, you mentioned the vegetated bioretention filters had a dramatic effect on removing target contaminants, was primarily for small plants. Would you expect trees to behave similarly?
Yeah, I myself have not directly worked with trees, but that is a really important aspect. I think it would depend substantially on the type of tree. I mean, for example, there are some trees that do take up substantial amounts of water, and so that can be an important way of directly taking those up. Some of it has to do though with the root structure, and so for example, deep-rooted grasses like some of the prairie grasses and blue stems and stuff, that they can have root systems that are 6-8 feet deep, and that allows the contaminants to, I mean, it provides a couple of benefits. First off, from a hydrologic perspective, it actually provides preferential flow paths and keeps the systems from clogging, because root turnover allows water to filter down along those edges. It also means that bacteria and fungi live along those roots and create zones of high biological activity. And so having kind of a strong fibrous rooting system, I think, is really beneficial. And you may or may not get that in trees, depending on what kind they are. So I think you'd kind of have to depend on that. And so maybe if you were with more bushes or willows or some things, I'm also just not quite as familiar with the root structures of trees too.
Okay. I have two requests here for getting access to those review papers that you mentioned, and one especially that's more accessible to cities. Are those available by emailing you, or do you want to give those to me and I can hand those out, or what's the best route for that?
Either way, I can email them directly to you, Ben, if you think that that's easier. And I can just kind of put those out there, because yeah, particularly the review on the vegetation, we actually even went through and it is a scientific paper. We're trying to be rooted in the primary research, but we're also trying to make it so that it's a paper so that it looks at it from a meta-analysis perspective and tries to distill useful conclusions. And it also is, we put together as part of the supporting information a bunch of links and regional guides for throughout the US in terms of what different state stormwater manuals have for suggested vegetation types and what they're there, because those things are highly regional too. I mean, we might be useful to look at what Minnesota has, but what they do in Washington State is probably not very useful to Iowa.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question here. You mentioned in some places the dissolved phosphorus could be 90%. What are the conditions that increase dissolved phosphorus?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'm not the best person to ask with that, because I focus on the organic side of things. I do know that it highly depends on things like, it basically depends on the water chemistry and some of the form that the phosphorus is applied in. So I'm not super familiar with, in terms of whether it's applied as a fertilizer or leaching directly from soils or something like that. But it does have a lot to do with basic water quality parameters as far as like alkalinity and pH and the carbonate content and stuff like that of the water itself. The person that wrote that section actually in the 2015 ASCE review paper goes into that a little bit more and did actually some modeling for that too, as far as like under different conditions. So it just kind of goes over that. The other person to contact with that is, I mean, I'm a great collaborator, or that sounds bad, a great collaborator. I collaborate well with the St. Anthony Falls Lab, and John Gulliver and Andy Erickson. They're doing a lot of really good work, particularly with that iron enhanced sand filters and the dissolved phosphorus work. So I'm happy to connect anybody with those people too.
Great. And your email's up there.
Yeah.
I think I've actually had a couple more requests for the papers and a link for the mechanical snow removal to reduce salt application. So what I think we'll do is I'll have Greg email me everything he's got related to everything he's covered today. And then I will make that available later this week with the video of this webinar. So let me see if there are any more questions at this point. Do you have something, Greg?
I have links to all the papers on my lab website, but you may or may not have access depending on what people's credentials are and stuff. So I always tell people you can find it, but if you can't get to it, you can always email. I have rights to send you a PDF or something like that, so it's fine. I just can't.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's do it that way.
Can't send it to.
So I will make that available to subscribers later this week.
Yeah. So.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Maybe we'll just give it one more minute, but I have not seen any more come in. So I'll probably close the webinar down here in 2 minutes or so. Greg will stick around for a few minutes if there's any other questions. But thank you everyone for coming virtually today. And we look forward to our 6th and final webinar next month. So I'll be sending out links for that as we get closer. So thanks again, Greg, and thanks for everyone for showing up.
Thanks for having me.